So this week, the traitor that we're looking at is fame and reputation. And maybe that's not something that you crave. Maybe you have no social media profiles. Maybe you do. And actually, you really enjoy when those little red icons go up to show that someone liked your picture on Facebook or admired your Instagram reel or even enjoyed your LinkedIn post, if that's your bag. And that little hit of feeling that you get gives you a little bit of that understanding of the desire for fame and reputation. Now, if we have the next picture, please. I don't know if you've heard of the phrase main character energy. So here's a little meme. So there's a guy being given a gold medal. He's really celebrating, and you discover he's actually at the very bottom of the podium. So this phrase called main character syndrome or main character energy. And I think we all know people that live their lives like that, who think that they are the main character in the book or film of their life. And while that to some extent is true, we are the main character, main character syndrome takes it a step further, where people become more and more self-centered and focusing on what they want. And they do things to make them be shown in the best possible light rather than thinking about other people. And I think the writer of the book of Ecclesiastes would understand that idea of being the main character. And I think the book reads quite a lot like the writer might have spent a lot of their time exploring their own main character energy, but ultimately finding that none of that actually satisfies. So the book is helping us to look at the things that we hope will make our lives feel worthwhile. But it turns out that they are the imposters. They don't give us that ultimate fulfillment. They're hollow and insubstantial. So this week, this desire for fame and reputation. And I think so often that's us wanting to get out of the ordinary. We want to be extraordinary. And that desire for fame and reputation can help us to lift us out of the grind of everyday life and into something just a little bit more extraordinary. We're going to look at Ecclesiastes chapter 4 and verses 13 to 16. And John Goldingay's version puts it like this. Better a young man who's poor but smart than a king who's old but a dimwit. I present these verses with no comment. Better a young man who's poor but smart than a king who's old but a dimwit, who doesn't know how to heed a warning anymore. Because from the prison house he can get out to become a king, even when he was born destitute in the kingdom. I saw all the living who walk about under the sun with the youth, the second king who stands in place of him. There was no end to all the people, to all before whom he stood. Also those who are after him will not rejoice in him, because this too is hollow, a shepherding of the wind. So Ecclesiastes says that there's this hollowness to the idea of building a reputation, of being known as a king, even if you're stupid. And it's better to be a poor man, a young man who's poor but smart, even though the king has all of that reputation. So he calls it a hollowness or a smoke or vapor, as you were hearing about last week. So fame and reputation being a recognizable name, it ends up meaning nothing. But is that how we all live, even in the Christian world? And we end up putting people on pedestals, other Christians. And we've seen over the last few years how problematic that is. How many times the big names, the big Christian leaders, the church leaders are revealed to be not who they present themselves to be. That whole fame and reputation that they have, actually, they've ended up not being particularly good people. And somehow we end up with this hierarchy of Christians. And we've got your Premier League Christians like Billy Graham or William Wilberforce, Charles Wesley, Andy Stanley, Beth Moore, those people that are big name Christians. And then you've got your championship Christians, the missionaries, the church leaders, the big name speakers. And do we end up putting ourselves in a division? League One, maybe League Two, National League? Do I think there are other Christians that are actually worse than me? Do we end up looking at Christians that are more extraordinary than us? Do we end up with a little league table of Christians? So even in the Christian world, it's hard not to chase fame and reputation. It's hard not to think of ourselves as that main character. I've never been one to really chase the spotlight. I think I'm pretty much ordinary, I've always really hated those icebreakers, when it's like, write down something exciting about yourself. And I just don't know what to put. I remember many years ago being a thing where you write one exciting thing about yourself. They put them all in a hat. You had to pull one out. You had to find the person that got that exciting thing. And then you had to introduce that person to the group with their really exciting, my hamster parachuted down the stairs. Taylor Swift's cousin is my mum's cleaner. And I remember the person that had mine just being ashen-faced and saying, how do I introduce you? I don't know what to say, because all I'd put down was my DNA, because it was the only unique thing I could think about me, which also probably tells you how geeky I was at that point. Always. But I think pretty ordinary. And when I think about the Christian friends that I had growing up, I think we've all ended up doing pretty ordinary things. None of them has yet written that Christian song that everyone across the country sings. None of us have written yet the era-defining Christian book. Some people that I used to go to church with aren't in church anymore. And I think we've all ended up being pretty ordinary. And that's what happens to most of us, right? We end up being pretty ordinary, doing ordinary things. But part of the problem is that everything around us is stories and tales of people being taken out of the ordinary. Something that gives people fame and reputation. But what happens if the force is not in you? If a radioactive spider doesn't bite you? What if you're never scouted for that team? What happens if you don't even end up Facebook famous? Well, as Christians, we are living ordinary lives, but with an extraordinary God. So I don't know if anyone, have the next slide, please. I don't know if anyone recognises this man. If you've been in church for many decades, you just might. But this is a man called Jim Elliot. Jim was an American, and 70 years ago in January, he died when he was 28. As a child, he and his brothers and sisters were taken to church by his parents. He became a Christian as a child. He went to a Christian college, and he became really interested in going out to speak to people who'd never heard of Jesus. And he went to Ecuador in South America, and he spent a couple of years learning Spanish and local languages and telling the people there about Jesus. But Jim really wanted to go to a very particular group of people, a people called the Huaorani, and they lived deep in the jungle in Ecuador. Other local people there called the Huaorani the Orca, and that name meant fierce or violent, because the Huaorani had killed several of the other local people. They'd also killed workers at an oil drilling company that was near their villages. Outsiders were afraid to work near the Huaorani. Jim wanted to reach these people and tell them about Jesus. Nowadays, isolated people groups like this are protected by governments because of the risk of disease to the people. But Jim and his friends wanted to do this. There were 4 of them. There's the pictures of them and their plane. So Jim and the 4 others, there were 5 in total. From 1955, they flew over the jungle in a plane, and they used a loudspeaker to call down to the Huaorani people. And they used a basket from the plane to pass gifts down to the people. Now, the pilot was called Nate Saint, and he thought that they could slowly get the people to trust them until it was safe enough for them to land the plane and to meet them. And they flew over the jungle for months. And one day, a Huaorani person sent a gift back up in the basket up to the plane, and they thought, right, we've made it. We think it's time. So then Nate Saint spotted a beach where he could land the plane. That's what they've done over there. And they built a house where they could live in and stay safe until they could go near the village. So these men, Roger Yoderin, Pete Fleming, Jim Elliot, Ed McCulley, and the pilot Nate Saint, he dropped them off one by one on the beach. And on the last night, Nate flew over the village and he told the people to go to the beach. And then he landed the plane. And then the 5 of them, they waited there. They waited and waited. 4 days later, a man and a woman from the Huaorani people arrived. The Americans cooked them dinner. Nate took them up in a plane so they could see the jungle. That's the picture up there of that first encounter. And the visitors left, and the missionaries just waited. They waited for other Huaorani people to come. 2 days later, it took another 2 days until anyone else came. It was the 8th of January. 6 days after they landed, and 2 women appeared out of the jungle. And Jim Elliot and Pete Fleming were really excited to see them, and they jumped in the river to walk towards them. But as they got closer, they realised the women didn't look friendly at all. And there was a cry from behind them, and out of the jungle, about 10 Huayawani warriors stood there with their spears raised, the spears pointing at them. Within a few seconds, all 5 missionaries were dead. Fame and reputation, these men got it. These men were famous for dying in this way. And 70 years ago, the deaths of these 5 people was headline news all around the world. There was the magazine Life had a 10-page article about them and about their lives and deaths. Thousands of Christians around the world were inspired by this story to leave their countries and tell people about Jesus. But that's not the end of the story. The next picture. So Elizabeth Elliot, who was Jim Elliot's wife, wrote this book, Shadow of the Almighty. Steve Saint, who was the son of Nate Saint, had this film made about him at the end of the spear. In the middle there, that is Steve Saint standing there. There's a picture of Jim Elliot. This is Ed McCulley's son, I think. On the left there is Minkei. He was one of the warriors that killed the men. So he killed Steve Saint's father and Ed McCulley. So those 2 people on the other side, this man killed some of them. But in the middle there is Bert and Colleen Elliot. You might have heard of Jim Elliot. You might have heard of Elizabeth Elliot. It's unlikely you will have heard of Bert and Colleen Elliot. So Bert is Jim's brother. He's there holding the picture of Jim. And it's actually Bert and Colleen that I really want to talk about. Can you imagine being the brother of Jim Elliot? Can you imagine the kind of fame and reputation that is then on your shoulders of having this brother who was so famous, who had this incredible reputation? For Bert and Colleen Elliot, if you have the next picture, thank you. Bert and Colleen were missionaries in Peru for a really long time. And someone once asked Bert about Jim. And Bert said, my brother Jim and I took different paths. He was a great meteor streaking through the sky. And that is definitely one sort of fame and reputation. Being a meteor, having a life that's only 28 years long, having a life where you spend a short amount of time, of just a couple of years, on this kind of mission field and then are killed for your faith. But let's have the next picture. Bert and Colleen, there they are, in Peru. They're missionaries in Peru for over 60 years. Now, my brother lived in Peru for 11 years, and I met Bert and Colleen on several occasions. Bert was a few years older than Jim. He went to Bible college and then went to Peru when he was 25. They lived in the jungle. They travelled up and down the rivers. They climbed mountains. They visited tiny villages. They did some medical work. They told people about Jesus. They started over 170 churches. They founded a school. 60 years they worked in Peru. Bert was not a meteor. Bert worked faithfully and quietly in many ways for so many years, often in the shadow of his brother Jim. Bert had a huge impact on that church, but he didn't do it like a meteor. Bert was faithful and he worked tirelessly. Another writer, I think it's on the next slide, there we go. If Jim was like a shooting star, Bert was a faint star that rose night after night, faithfully crossing the same path in the sky to God's glory. Some of us might go on to have that instant impact in changing people's lives like Jim Elliot. Hopefully not in the same way as Jim Elliot. Hopefully you don't meet, some group of people from Norfolk or something. But some of us might have that amazing meteor-like impact. But most of us are not going to do that. We have to learn how to be those faint stars that rise night after night, faithfully crossing the same path in the sky to God's glory. And that's okay. God wants us to be us. Bert Elliot couldn't be Jim Elliot, but what he did was incredible. 60 years ago, loads of people knew the name Jim Elliot. They would have been able to tell you a story. Hardly anyone could have told you the name of Bert Elliot. But Bert was faithful. So what does it mean to be ordinary? Or what does it mean to be an ordinary Christian? A Christian who isn't conned by the traitor of fame and fortune. Oh, it means to be more like Christ, to be more like Jesus. That's our standard. That's who we should be comparing ourselves, not in our own personal league tables of where we think different Christians are. Not someone I think that is not as spiritual as I am. It's all right, I'm not that person. But we compare ourselves to Christ and to Jesus, and suddenly I don't feel quite as brilliant anymore. I'm crashing down those leagues pretty swiftly. So Jesus takes that whole idea of who is the best Christian and he turns it on his head. We put divisions in the faith where there shouldn't be any. We put people, we put leaders, we put friends on a pedestal and think that they're more spiritual than we are. And we've totally missed the point, because the point is, who do we compare ourselves to? If fame and reputation aren't to be this hollow vapor, this smoke, we need to start comparing ourselves to something who is more solid than that, to Jesus himself. And when we start to do that, then things look very different. And if we read those stories in the Bible, the stories of Jesus in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we see a leader, a saviour, who didn't seek out fame and reputation. He doesn't always explain things that are going on. He often makes people promise that they're not going to tell other people what happens to them. This isn't the act of someone who's trying to seek out fame. In fact, he spends lots of time hanging out with people that would really damage his reputation. That's who we should be learning to be more like, not even more like Jim Elliot or Bert Elliott. Christian writer Michael Kelly put it like this: in the kingdom of God, there is a great need for streaking meteors, but most of us won't be like that. We will instead be faint stars. We will go through life day after day, doing very much the same thing tomorrow that we did today. The important thing for us to remember is that we are needed. There is a great need for people willing to chase the little donkeys of life, not because it's exciting, but because they believe in the constant presence and purpose of God. There is a great need for people willing to stand in the midst of the boring, convinced there is no such thing as ordinary when you follow an extraordinary God. The type of fame and reputation that we read about in Ecclesiastes and that we find here, that's all going to vanish like a smoke compared to following God faithfully. When we understand that, then we can start to see the traitor that fame and reputation really are. So let's go out of here this afternoon, go into our ordinary lives today and tomorrow and the next day, convinced that we follow an extraordinary God.